Well, welcome everyone. I think we'll get started so we can be as prompt as possible. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Louisa Poster. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Concord Carlisle Human Rights Council. If anyone needs an assisted hearing device, we have them at the entrance over there, and you can be helped by Mark, sorry, I forgot your name, who could help you with them. If anybody needs them, you could raise your hand and he could come over. So welcome to everyone who's here in this room and everyone who is at home on Zoom. We're gathered together here at this Town of Concord sponsored event to commemorate the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This year, the United Nations General Assembly designated January 27th, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Traditionally, our event in Concord is held in June, so we are here now. On this annual day of commemoration, the UN urges every member state to honor the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and millions of other victims of Nazism, and to develop educational programs to help prevent future genocides. Susan Bates is here to represent the Concord Select Board. Susan?
Hi, everybody. I'm honored to be representing the Select Board tonight. And I want to offer thanks to Sarah Napier and Ronnie Olitsky and the Concord Carlisle Human Rights Council for organizing this event. For the past 11 years, the town and the Human Rights Council have collaborated to hold this important event. Again this year, the Select Board voted to issue a proclamation, which I'll read in a minute. As we know, the Holocaust occurred in German-occupied territories during World War II in the 1940s. Very few eyewitnesses are left to tell their stories. We honor the stories that we've already heard and rely on family members such as our speakers today, Erwin Hipsman and Sid Levin, to continue to educate us about this horrible time in human history. I recently learned from a New Yorker article by Masha Gessen about the 1941 slaughter of 33,771 Jews in 36 hours at Babin Yar in the Ukraine, which was then occupied by Germany. This was among the first acts of mass murder of Jews during the Second World War, and according to the author, remains the biggest single mass execution of the Holocaust. We know that the Holocaust was not the first or the last deliberate extermination of a group of people identified by their religion, ethnic or racial background, or political beliefs. It's vital to our education as human beings to learn as much as possible about these events in order to shine a light on them and to learn the lessons that they teach. While there are ethnic, racial, and cultural differences among us, we all strive to uphold common ideals of respect, civility, and kindness. Proclamation, Days of Remembrance for the Victims of the Holocaust. Whereas the Holocaust was the state-sponsored systematic persecution and annihilation of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between 1933 and 1945, 6 million were murdered. Roma, people with disabilities, and Poles were also targeted for destruction or decimation for racial, ethnic, or national reasons. And millions more, including homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents, also suffered grievous oppression and death under Nazi tyranny. And whereas the history of the Holocaust offers an important opportunity to reflect on the moral responsibilities of individuals, societies, and governments, and whereas we, the people of Concord, should always remember the terrible events of the Holocaust and the genocides in Armenia, Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, and Darfur. We all have a duty to use these memories as a catalyst to rid us of racial hatred, intolerance, tyranny, and discrimination. And whereas we, the people of the town of Concord, should actively rededicate ourselves to the principles of individual freedom in a just society, and whereas April 28, 2022 has been designated pursuant to an act of Congress and internationally as a day of remembrance for the victims of the Nazi Holocaust, known as Yom HaShoah. And whereas it is appropriate for the people of Concord to join in international commemoration, and now therefore, we, the Concord Select Board, recognize the Holocaust Remembrance events sponsored by the Concord Carlisle Human Rights Council to be held in person in the Concord Townhouse and virtually on Sunday, April 24th, 2022 at 7 p.m. and proclaim the week of April 24th, 2022 through May 1st, 2022 as days of remembrance for the victims of the Holocaust. Thank you.
So this year we are honored to welcome Erwin Hipsman of Concord and Sid Levin of Carlisle as our speakers. Erwin and Sid are first cousins and the sons of Holocaust survivor parents. Their mothers, Ella Hipsman and Joyce Levin, are sisters who survived the Holocaust by hiding in the forests of Poland along with remaining members of their family. Today, Ella and Joyce have been blessed with 3 sons each and live within a few miles of each other outside of Boston. Erwin and Sid will share their mother's stories along with reflections on what it was like to grow up under the dark cloud of their parents' haunting memories. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Louisa. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone here. And thank you, everyone on the Zoom call for listening to my mother's, my aunt's story. I have some numbers, three boys, 3 children, 6 grandchildren, 4 great-grandchildren, 2 heart attacks, and 1 hip surgery. My mom is a survivor. She's going to turn 90 this year. I visited her today, and I was telling her I was going to come and speak to people in Concord. She says, don't forget to tell them this story, and don't forget to tell them that story. And actually, one of the stories that she told me not to forget to tell, Sid created a video. My mom gave testimony to the Spielberg Shoah Foundation video. And so we have a very short clip of that will show after Sid introduces his mom. But my mom is Ella. She's also called Elka in Yiddish and Edzia in Polish. So lots of times she goes back and forth between the 3. But more often than not, she's called Ella. She worked at Colonial Meats for many years. She was the lady who put Fenway Franks into the boxes that went to Fenway Park. And then she was she worked on the floor at Milton's in Chestnut Hill for many years. So occasionally I'll run into people who will say, that was your mother at Milton's? She called herself the European fashion designer. So with that, we have most of it will be very serious, obviously, what we're talking about. We'll wend a little bit of humor into our story as well.
Yes, these are stories of survivors, so I want everybody to feel good about the fact that Erwin and I are here to share their stories, because they're still with us, which is a miracle unto itself. My mother is the woman you see in Webster's dictionary when you look up Jewish grandmother. That's her picture. She has been blessed with the grandchildren, 3 sons. She has, let me see, grandchildren, 1, 2, that's 3, 4 in total. She is living independently at a beautiful condo in Chestnut Hill. Unfortunately, my dad passed away. Both our moms are widowed at this moment. She didn't work at the meat packing industry, but she did work at she would make those sandwiches for the canteen trucks. So all the canteen trucks that you would buy sandwiches from, she would go to work at 7 at night, and she would get home just before we got to school, had to go to school the next morning, and that's what she did. I'll never forget one day, I was doing my paper route, and on Sundays, those papers were huge. My mother went out at midnight on her way back from work, stopped at the Stop and Shop, found a shopping cart laying around in the parking lot, put it in the back of the car, and brought it to me so I could use that Stop and Shop shopping cart to deliver my Sunday newspapers. So that was my mother. Obviously, these are all things that they gained strength from dealing with what they dealt with. I hope she has figured out Zoom and is joining us today because I shut my phone off. Usually it's a phone call, the internet is out, the car won't start, things like that. But I do want to let you know that she was called Yospa when she was growing up. She's still referred to as Yospa, that's her Yiddish name. She's known as Joyce now. So when we show this clip of Erwin's mom telling a small story about what happened to them, I just wanted to give you context that it's Elke and Yospa is Ella, Joyce. And if you'll excuse me, I have to share my.
His family grew up in Malden, and we grew up in Mattapan. My mom, this house is going on the market soon, but she lived in West Roxbury very recently.
Then I remember we got sick. We got the children's stuff, measles and chicken pox. My mother covered us with branches under a tree with Joyce. And she told us, don't move. Don't even breathe. I'm going to the village and see if I can bring you something. She went. My father was dead by then. She went. I don't know how she could find us back at night. And she brought us. Whatever they gave us, she brought us. Maybe she was stealing too. And she brought us maybe a little bit milk, maybe a piece of bread. Whatever she could, she brought us. And then it was another oblab and we ran again. Once my mother had us, she was holding us. We had to cross a pit. Never forget this. We crossed the pit. And somehow the large German saw us. And he made with his hands to cross it over fast. When we crossed this, he gave one shot. And we ran away. It was amazing. I don't know why he did. I don't know. But then when we saw Germans shooting at us, but we were running. But this was the one time that I had encountered them in the woods.
So it was the summer of 1939. My mother and her sister and a small contingent of family members would go summer in a town called Unin, next to Pachev in Poland. My great-grandmother had a very small farm there, a small, frail little horse, a very small cow, and maybe a few chickens. But it was a chance for my mother and her sister to get out of Warsaw, where her parents made a comfortable living. But summers, they would love to go to the farm, and that's where they ended up in 1939, when their maid told their father that it was not safe for them to come back to Warsaw. The ghettos were starting to be formed, and the Jews were starting to be taken. So they had to stay in 1939 in this small farm of my great-grandmother, along with her 5 children, and try to survive while they awaited an opportunity maybe to go back home. They never went back home. Their last names were Davidovich. That was their names when they were growing up in Poland. Their dad, Chaim, which was also Erwin's dad's name, their dad, Chaim, was a maker of what we would call patio furniture. That was his job back in Warsaw. And their mother, Shandel, Shirley as she was known here, was a seamstress. I just want to tell you that at one point we had 5 generations of our family alive in this country, much to the efforts of Shandel, my grandmother. They led a comfortable life, like I said, but the world started to close in on them very quickly. It was decided that the 2 sisters, Ella and Joyce, both about 8 and 5 at the time, my mother maybe 6, these stories are hard to get from them. There's no documentation. I think it was, maybe I was 9, no, I was 8. Okay, you were 8, and that's how we deal with it. And so their parents would continue to go back and forth. They would stay on the farm, but Mom and Dad would go back and forth to see what they could do and see what they could bring back to keep them fed. At one point, it was probably, in 1941, that it wasn't safe to go back to Warsaw, and it wasn't safe to stay at the farm. The only option they had to them was to go into the woods and begin years of hiding.
So where they were was about 30 miles west of the today's Polish-Russian border. So they were in eastern Poland. And my mom and Joyce being from Warsaw, there was a woman in that village who was the wealthiest woman in the village. She had a nice house, and she would let her daughter play with my mother and Joyce because they were from Warsaw, they wore nice clothes, they were sophisticated, they spoke a nice Polish, etc. And so the girl became friends with my mother and Joyce, and then the Germans took over her house, took over that lady's house, because it was the biggest house in the area. They took it over as their sort of command post. And one day a German soldier came in, and my mother was playing with the little girl, and the German soldier says to the Polish girl, she a Juda, she's Jewish. And she says, no, she's Polish. And then, this is the story my mother told me, don't forget to tell. And then the German soldier puts his finger into my mother's chest and says, Juda. No, Polish. And my mother does the sign of the cross to show the German soldier she was not Jewish. So her mother had taught her that. And then she went back home and told her parents what had happened. They said, tomorrow we go in. And spent the next 2 years in the woods.
Before they went into the woods, my great-grandmother had 5 children, and one of them, I think his name was Skul, Uncle Skul, and Uncle Moishe. So there's been my mom's uncles, went into the woods to dig out bunkers. That's how they were going to hide. You don't hide above ground, you hide below ground. So they dug bunkers. And when it was time to go in, that's where they went first, to where those bunkers were dug, began to hide in them. Meantime, my mother, and again, this timeline is still vague. We don't really know exactly when. They were very young. And unfortunately, my grandmothers and anybody else who might have been slightly older at that time are not here to sort of verify the information. But it was decided that my mother was too young to go to the woods and hide. It was winter. So with a sewing machine, some jewelry, they bribed a Christian neighbor to take my mother, her uncle, my great-grandmother, and I think, and then her aunt. Now, these are my great-grandmother's children, 3 of them, and hide them under the floorboards of a barn along with the livestock. Not a place you could stand up straight. And that is where they put my mother and the rest of the family there to hide them until such time that they could figure out what was next. But being a winter in Poland, my mom wasn't going to survive. This is the hard part. It took, we think, through the winter, into the spring, and into early summer that my grandmother, my mom's mom, would come back every day with just a little bit of food, whatever she could take and steal, whatever she could find. And my mother tells this story because she lives with this as her haunting memory of abandonment by her mom. She couldn't understand, where did mom go every day, and sometimes more than one day. She felt this abandonment, and this is something that haunts her. More than all the other memories she, encountered during that time of hiding, this was the worst. And Ella, Erwin's mom, remembers this story very well, that when they finally were able to get them out of the barn because the Germans did not take kindly to anyone who hid Jews, so they suffered the same fate as the Jews would. And the farmer said, you can no longer keep your family here. It's getting too dangerous. You're going to have to get them out. My mother was found with lice covering her entire body. Crouched over, she couldn't walk upright for weeks. And fortunately, her uncle did not suffer the same fate, but the food that was basically thrown down through the floorboards was what kept them alive, delivered every day by my grandmother, because they couldn't all stay together. It was too dangerous. I think that's a good spot.
So they were in the woods for 2 years, 1941 to 1943, till Russians, as the war was changing, as the Germans started losing, Russians would come back in Poland, and so the Russians, in a sense, liberated them. Very ironic when you look at what's happening today. But, and they were with the partisans. My mother used this word oblava in the video. I don't know if you caught that. That was sort of when the Germans came in. Because think about them, they were like in the middle of Vermont, probably 10 miles from the closest village or 5 miles from the closest village. Germans didn't want to go in there because the partisans had rifles and they would shoot them as well. And so, there'd be like an encampment, and then the partisans would go out and, do the partisan type work. But whenever the Germans came into the woods, it'd be an oblava, and everybody would just scatter, and they would lose each other, and then they'd find each other again. Sid talked earlier about the bunkers. So another one of the stories my mom said, don't forget to tell people, was they had 2 bunkers that they had set, for this group of people, let's say 30 in one bunker, 30 in the other bunker. And this was in the winter. And what happens to the bunkers is where people are, the snow melts. So the Germans come in and they see there's a bunker. They know there's people underground. They find the hole and they drop hand grenades in. There were 2 bunkers. Germans came in. Everyone raced to one bunker or the other. And my mother went into the bunker that the Germans decided not. They'd done their job for the day. They took out one bunker. They can go back, even though the other bunker was probably 50 yards away. And if they'd spent 10 minutes, they would have found another bunker. But that's what she says. It's also what my father says as well, is you go left, you go right. You pick one, and right was the wrong decision and left was the right decision. You just don't know. And then, so the war ended, not the war ended, in 1943, the Russians sort of cleared, were clearing out the Germans from that zone. Miraculously, almost everybody in the family survived. There were, I think, 2 or 3 people who didn't, but an incredible percentage of the family survived, frankly, because of the leadership and the strength of our grandmother. I mean, she had to have been a force. She protected those girls like, just like a lion would protect the cubs.
Now, she lost her husband. We just don't know this time period again, but he succumbed by either catching a cold or getting the flu or whatever it was, but couldn't get medication. So he died of natural causes. So she was left a widow during that time. We don't know if he died prior to them going into the woods or it was during the time they were in the woods. I do want to say that their uncle, School, was a Polish soldier in the Polish army, and he knew the woods like he didn't need satellites to guide him through GPSs. He was, he was Google Maps for them, and that's why they were always able to stay just one spot ahead of where the soldiers were, because he knew where to go. So that was a saving grace. Unfortunately, School and his sister, who was pregnant, again, we don't know the backstory of them, but they came together under a tree at the time that the Germans were doing this oblava, and unfortunately, they both lost their lives at the same time. So School, the person who knew that the woods was killed. And those are the two that were shot to death during time.
And so the war ends. The remaining members of the family worked their way to a DP camp, displaced persons camp. And my father, who survived by going into Russia when his village was about to get the final roundup, he came back. He was in Berlin doing black market, and he found a matchmaker, and the matchmaker introduced him to my mother. Turns out my mother and father are sixth cousins. His village is right on the Russian border, 30 miles away from the other village, so they're all sort of related there. And my mom got married in probably 1947, I would think. She was in the DP camp for about 5 years. And she tells a story, she didn't tell me to tell this one, about how all the women, because a lot of people got married in DP camp, they all shared one wedding dress. So it went from one to one to one. But our grandmother was a seamstress, so actually her wedding dress fit her, whereas most people, the wedding dresses didn't fit. From a DP camp, my older brother was born in a DP camp in '51, and they were able to fly because they had a baby, so they flew across to New York, and they had an agency in Kansas City who agreed to settle them. My mom took the train across the country, and she needed to cook farina for my brother, and she went into the kitchen of the not the Amtrak, they didn't have Amtrak there, but of the Pullman, and she just said she never saw a kitchen that big, and the chefs with the hats, and she said, I didn't speak a word of English, but we communicated, and I was able to make food for the baby. After a year, everyone else in the family, grandmother Joyce, went to Boston. So after a year, they were free to go wherever they wanted, and they came back to Boston. So the family was reunited. And Sid, you're going to talk a little about community in Boston amongst the survivors.
Also, my grandmother met, during their time hiding in the woods, she met this gentleman who then became her husband, and they got married. He was from the town of Vladova. And they all went there, and then she was married in Vladova, and she had in Germany, so Ella was having a kid a couple of years later, and my grandmother was also having a child, and my aunt Linda, as she was known then as Leah, was born in Germany. So Leah and Michael were both born in Germany during the camp. Well, they called them, they were not really ghettos in the camps. My dad was, unfortunately, in the ghetto, in the camps, but they were taught as young children in Germany. The elders became their teachers. They were basically like in a kibbutz, and if you know what a kibbutz is in Israel, they had set up a little kibbutz in Germany during this time that they were waiting. My mother did not have a young child. Ella was granted first-class accommodations on board a plane to go from Germany to the United States. My mother, not having a child, had to go by boat, which took forever. And she says the accommodation on the boat reminded her of the barn. I mean, it was just as cramped, food being thrown down, people not making it. It was, it was pretty bad. But she met this woman on the boat who said, don't worry, I have somebody in Boston who knows somebody who's going to know somebody who's going to get you married. Don't worry. So the matchmaker was already on the boat. The Yenta, as they called him, was already on the boat making arrangements, and my mother did meet my dad, who was a Holocaust survivor as well, as was Erwin's dad. My dad spent most of his time during the war in the camps. That's for another day. But they got married, and he worked at the Malden knitting mills. I don't know if you remember the Lawrence mills, but Mr. Feuerstein, this is a funny story, because I want to have some humor here. My dad worked for the old man, as he used to call him, the man who owned the mills. And it was a Jewish-run organization. They had the Sabbath off. They had all the Jewish holidays off. And my dad could work Sundays if he wanted and some overtime. But he'll never forget, the old man came through one night and saw that the bathroom light was left on over the weekend. He didn't like that. So he came to my father and he goes, Jerry, who's leaving the light on in the bathroom? Can't leave the lights on in the bathroom over the weekend. It's God forbid you're going to burn a little bit more electricity. And my dad was so stunned that the boss was, pointing him out on this, that after the old man left, his son walked by, who was the guy who basically paid off all of his employees during the fire. His son comes by and says to my dad, we'll fix the switch. Don't worry about it. So anyway, they all came here, and we grew up in Malden. My dad worked in the factories. As I said, my mom did the canteen trucks, but she did get a job at BU working at one of the dorms. And she did that for, 15, 20 years. And I went to BU, and everybody thought that I was going for free because my mother worked at BU. If you work at BU, she didn't work for BU, she worked for the food services, so I paid my way through BU. But she was always right down the street at 700 feeding the students, and she loved it, absolutely loved it. They surrounded themselves with folks who came here and had the same stories. If you look at all the bar mitzvah and wedding movies, they all have the same 35 people, and it's like they created their little ghetto, their little shtetl, their little community, because they all felt safe. They felt safe to be here, and they felt safe amongst their friends. So it was quite an opportunity to grow up with all of these.
Yeah, they were like aunts to us, all their friends and uncles.
Big family.
But what was interesting was that they play cards all the time. So every 8 weeks to be my parents' house, and they go to someone else's house. We would listen to them and chatting and talking. I don't remember them ever talking about their experiences when they were together. This is in the safety of nobody else around, just the 6 guys in one room, the 6 women in another room. Once in a while, they might talk about it, but they would, that was third rail to them, even amongst themselves. I mean, everyone knows that talking to your children about it is third rail, but even amongst themselves during that time period, or during those first 20, 30 years after the war, they just didn't go there with each other either, which I found really interesting. As Sue and I were preparing, I sort of was doing a rewind in my head, and just don't recall that happening at all. One thing that they all went to Revere Beach. I remember one summer we actually rented a house from Revere Beach. We finally made it. We could
you
go
remember
to
that
Revere
house?
Beach.
It was like it tilted, just had a nice little tilt. I'm like,
But they would see a sign that said MOTEL at Revere Beach, and they look at each other and say, Muttel's doing great. Muttel's got a big building. And then they would see Muttel again, like they go somewhere else, and Muttel again. They realize that's not Muttel's place, that's a motel.
well, my mother tells the story that when she came off the boat, she saw in New York City the to let, which is renting. Of course, to her, that meant toilet. And she says, look at how nice these people are. They tell us where all the toilets are. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Those to let. Which reminds me of my dad, when Walter Mondale was running for president. I said to my dad, Dad, who do you think you're going to vote for? He goes, well, I'll tell you. I think I'm going to vote for Mendel. Who's Mendel? Walter Mendel. I said, Dad, it's Mondale, and he ain't Jewish. Another story. We'll have
One
to-
more.
Yeah. And then, so my grandmother's, so I just want to give you a little bit more of the family. So when my grandmother came here with Vadya, her husband that she married in Vladova, she also came over with her brother, Moishe, who started a family in Brooklyn, New York. And the other brother that survived, Toivia, stayed in Frankfurt, Germany, did not come to the United States. And it was almost 45 years to the day that they had not spoken with my grandmother, their sister, in this country. So Erwin and I have both had the pleasure of going to Germany to meet with Toivia. And it was really hard because it was like 45 years, so I took him to the post office. And I said, we're going to call the United States and you're going to talk to your sister. And the first time in 45, 47 years. And he goes, what am I going to say? I said, you'll find something to talk about. All they talked about was how sick they were. I've got this, I've got that, this doesn't work, that doesn't work. That was their 15 or 20-minute conversation. That was all they said. But he did tell me a story, and you can just picture this. So while they were hiding in the woods, obviously, I don't know if it was in a bunker, under a tree, whatever, because at night, that's when they travel. During the day, you don't go anywhere, and you stay low. And he woke up, and opened his eyes, and it was pure white. So he knew he had died. He knew he had been killed, only to find out it had snowed. So once he wiped the snow away, he realized, but he says that was, to him, one of the most frightening moments, is to open his eyes and not see anything and to think he had died. So that was Toivia.
But when we asked our parents, like, why did he stay in Germany? And the answer is, we don't know why.
I think I know.
Oh, tell me.
Nobody ever spoke of his wife. I think there was something.
Oh, really? One of those?
I think something was going on. I'm like, he's married. Nobody ever spoke of him.
So moving it towards us a little bit, growing up, here we are growing up in the United States of America, and, the mission is to assimilate as quickly as possible. And I can remember, I sort of did, again, a rewind over the past few days. Who were my friends? So we lived in Mattapan, and none of my friends were children of Holocaust survivors. And, we never would talk about it, like, what's with your parents' accent? Why did they talk so funny? It was just never ever talked about. And I went to Maimonides, and there were few Holocaust survivor kids. Again, this is, we're talking, 1960s. I mean, the awareness, what we know now, is so much different. And, the Holocaust education in Maimonides then was once a year they'd bring you into the auditorium and they'd play Night and Fog, that movie, which is just the hardest movie to see as anybody, let alone as kids. And that was your Holocaust education for the year. But there was one family, the Gottlieb family, who they were Holocaust survivors. The parents were, and very, very, very chaotic household. But I spent a tremendous amount of time at their house. Again, we didn't talk about it, but this is where I was comfortable, was with this other family, and just because I knew there was a shared experience. But the same way that the adults didn't talk to us about it, and they didn't talk to themselves about it. We didn't talk amongst each other. I just saw this a little video yesterday that just really struck me. There was I don't know if people have heard, the second Holocaust survivor has died in Ukraine. So 75 years later, you're this time it's the Russians, who killed you. But they had this one woman who they were interviewing. I think she had gone out of Mariupol, and she had a little girl. And the interviewer said, what are you going to tell your daughter when she grows up? She goes, I'm not telling my daughter anything about this. She's not going to remember. And in 30 years, I'll maybe talk to her about it. And it really struck me, because that's about the amount of time, when I think about when my parents started opening up, and people know about the psychology of survivors not talking about it. And what I was wondering is it because finally the the PTSD in the brain and the body have sort of let down enough and you feel safe enough to talk about it? Or is it that your kids are now 30 years old and they're adults and you can talk about it? And clearly it's both, that they're able to talk about it and there's somebody who can listen, who can process the information. But, even with, and you just see that, even that woman, she picked that 30-year number just out of a hat. It felt like out of a hat, but I just found it so telling as to that was our experience. So basically, we grew up like Americans. We were American kids. We wanted, baseball and all the things that American kids do, and we're fully assimilated. Yes, we can understand Yiddish, we speak Yiddish, but fully assimilated kids. I mean, we grew up in Jewish neighborhoods, but we were Americans, and the Holocaust was sort of a clouds way off in the distance. And as we got older, they got closer and closer to us. And as you pay attention to what's happening in the world, they sort of the storm crashes on you. And sort of my sort of final remark is that these are very ordinary people. I mean, you hear they're tailors, they work in food services. These are people that grew up in shtetls, or they were in Warsaw, but they were still just regular people in Warsaw, but they're very ordinary people with incredibly extraordinary lives.
I just want to let you know that my father came to this country with 3 of his 6 brothers. And two of his brothers are still alive. One is going to turn 105 in May. Uncle Harvey, he's living in Newton, still at home. His brain should go to the Smithsonian for research because he is what we don't have for our mother's side of the family, I have for my father's side of the family. He is a walking encyclopedia to the time, dates, he's unbelievable. And I think I started to learn more about the Holocaust maybe in my late 40s because, or maybe it was probably my late 40s, where Uncle Harvey unfortunately got a little shicker at my house, meaning got a little drunk at a party, and he couldn't drive himself home. So I said, Uncle Harvey, I'll drive you home. While we're driving home, he's sitting in the back, and he goes, and again, nobody talked about anything, but maybe he was just a little bit weak to hold back. And he says, Sidney, I'm going to tell you something. You're not going to believe it. And I go, all right, Uncle Harvey, go ahead. It's not Levin. I go, what? He goes, no, your last name is Katz, K-A-T-Z. Your grandfather changed it so his sons wouldn't be taken to the front lines to fight in Lithuania. And so at the last minute, a neighbor came to him and said, change your name from Katz to Levin, because Katz denotes the priestly tribe in the Jewish religion. You're a Kohen, and those are the ones that come in for first. So he went and scratched out his names in all the books that he had. So when the police came to say, okay, bring us your sons, he goes, who are you looking for? And they said, we're looking for Katz. He goes, we're not Katz, we're Levin. Showed him all the books in the library and everything he had. Levin, Levin, Levin. And they left him. So if I had to go search my family tree, I would be barking up a wrong one because I am a Katz, I'm not 11. I'm still 11 now, I'm keeping it. But that's what my Uncle Harvey told me that one day. So when you think about it, this is what we're dealing with every day, every other video, every other show. We're learning something new about our past that nobody really spoke to us about. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for listening.
So I thought it would be nice for you to see.
We will take some questions as well. I don't think we're taking Zoom questions, though. Okay.
Fortunately,
Battery?
all right, so why don't we take some questions? I do want you to see pictures of the 3 sisters that are still alive that have survived today, so you can see some before and some afters.
Questions? So here.
Going into the village nearby, how did she
So my grandmother, the question was, how did my grandmother survive? So my grandmother, Shirley, or Scheindel, so she was in the woods. But what they would do is they would go into the village. I mean, again, think of Vermont. They're far enough away that nobody can find them, but an hour, 2-hour walk, they can get into a village or to a farmer, and either steal food or with a gun and say, give us your food, or beg for food. So they were able to get food, by going into houses or the village to get scraps, go into the garbage.
Would she do that by herself, or would she have a partner?
I think they would go. I think there'd be like 1 or 2 people would go, just because it's a little bit of safety in numbers. But they would always go at night, and they, as I understand, they usually would go to farmers, because into the village, I mean, they could find you. They go to a farmer, and then the farmers would tell. They say the people came, and then the Germans would come out and look for them, and then they would have to run. And the way my mother talks about it, like every 2 or 3 days they were moving. I don't know if it was that frequently, but my bet is at least every 2 or 3 weeks they were going somewhere else. You couldn't stay put, that was for sure. Yeah, there's a question here. I can't understand the question, sorry. Yeah, what did religion play a role in their lives? That is an interesting question. I would, they were not observant in the United States. My father, up until he retired, only went to temple a few times a year. After he retired, he went to, he became a regular at the temple in West Roxbury. I would generally say no, that religion did not play a major role in their lives. I mean, they were, Sid, do you have a take on that?
As far as religion?
Yeah, playing a major role in their lives.
My dad, very much so.
Yeah,
he wanted
But
to attend.
on the mother side, I don't think that's core to. They would say yes, it's core to who they are, but but in the levels of degrees, I wouldn't say that was core.
I do remember asking, I'm sorry. I do remember asking my mother a long time ago, how could you still believe in God after what happened to you? And at that moment, she says, I don't know if I do. But I think she does. I think she's very much a believer and, true to the Jewish religion, all of that. But I think I caught her off guard a little bit. And it was hard for her to sort of give me a straight answer right away. But I don't doubt that she's, but it's hard. But I asked that question, so that's my answer. But my dad was very religious. My grandfather was very religious. And I lived in a 3-family home in Malden, which the upstairs, we lived in the middle. All our neighbors were Christians, and I remember talking about assimilating. My mother had one of those little plastic plants that you plug in, and the rosebuds have a little bulb in them. That was my Christmas tree, Christmas time, because I didn't want to be left out, because the people downstairs, the people upstairs, and the people either side of us all had these beautiful trees that they lit up at Christmas, and I'm like, I'm not going to be left out. So I plugged a little plant in during Christmas, and that was my Christmas tree. And the other thing, I remember they always had a cross over their bed, which I thought was interesting. And we got a big box left over from a refrigerator, and we all slept out at night, me with my Christian neighbors who I adored. But I painted a little cross at the end of the box, because I just thought that's what you're supposed to do, And, again, we never had, my parents were fearful sometimes of non-Jews, but and I think they came a long way. It was really hard for them, but they accepted everybody I brought home. Not always first, but eventually they did. So it was hard. I mean, we were the ones that brought in, people of color, people of different nationalities, different ethnic backgrounds, and so they had, and marrying out of the faith. that was the big one, right? So.
When we used to go camping, when I tell my parents we're going camping, it's like they thought that was like, what are you doing in the woods? It's like, and you think that's fun, going camping? They just could not understand why somebody would ever go out into the woods, go camping.
Well, I live in Carlisle, so you know what my mother says. Why did you have to move with all the woods here?
So many trees. Can't you live in a city? Other questions coming up, or?
I will.
Any other questions? Well, my father spoke here a few years ago, about 15 years ago. Oh, I have to find out whether there's a video of that, whether the town has saved and kept all those videos. My father had, my mother was blessed and rejoiced that a high percentage of the family survived. My father was the exact opposite. Virtually nobody survived in his family. I mean, just, one aunt was it. So, and, the one regret I have is I never asked them. I asked them a little bit about Berlin and doing the black market activity there. I wish I dug a lot deeper into that. That could have been interesting.
All right, go ahead. I have a funny story.
So DP camps were set up by the United States, the UN, because you had thousands. I mean, probably, I was looking at some data today. I think it was like 250,000 survivors of the Holocaust, Jewish survivors. So Jewish agencies were funding these camps. And so basically, you needed a place to process people because there's nowhere to go back to.
You had to have a sponsor too. You couldn't just come over to the United States.
No, but to go to camp, they all, people went to different camps. The camp my mother was at, it was a DP camp, not a concentration camp. It was an airfield, a German airfield, so there were barracks and all that, and there was a place to get food, and they, created communities there. My mother loved being at the camps. I mean, she was safe, there was food, there were lots of kids to play with, there was education, there was people coming by all the time to see them. So, but the camps stayed open because it takes a long time to process people. If you have family, then we're going to send your family. But people went to, Israel, the United States, Canada, Australia. They went all over the world to get settled. And the camps stayed open till about 1957 is my recollection. So, my parents left relatively early, 51, but there were still people who were displaced from the war up until 1957, because it's a lot of work to process folks. I mean, the Ukraine situation is sort of very analogous, but people aren't going to DP camps. They're settling all over the place, people's homes or whatever. But I assume at some point there's going to be, there'll be the equivalent of a displaced person camp, because not everyone has a place to go. But at least it's, it's a place where you can get services, and the agencies can come in and try to help people and figure out, what do we do? How do we get them jobs? And because whether if they're going to stay in Eastern Europe, or they're going to go over to Western Europe, or they're going to migrate to other parts of the world, and then eventually those people are going to want to come back. It's going to take 20 years for some people to get back to Ukraine, because there's no there's nowhere to go. You're not going back to Mariupol. So unlike very few of the people went back to sea, but nobody left Eastern Europe and then came back to resettle. I mean, that's going to be the difference between what happened after, at least the Jews after World War II, who no one came back, whereas the Ukrainians would clearly want to go back to Ukraine. It's just how long is it going to take until there's a viable place to go back to, even when it's over. So, but DP camps, it's there's been a fair amount of literature written about them, because they had newspapers. I mean, they basically were creating a community, because it was not a short-term affair. It was many years.
I asked my mother if she'd like to go back to Warsaw to see where she grew up and where she lived. So I went on Google Maps to go down the street where she lived. House is gone, it's all modern, buildings. So would have been hard for her to go back and see nothing, because it's not there anymore.
I mean, Warsaw was Mariupol. Warsaw just got
Yeah,
totally leveled, and there was nothing left.
I'm going to show you the.
If you could use that microphone.
Oh, okay, thank you. All right. Erwin, do you want to explain?
I forget, oh, this is this is my grandfather, my mother and Joyce's dad. So he was the one who was the patio furniture maker, who died either before the war or during the war. We've heard conflicting stories. That was my great-grandmother. So she actually did make it to the United States. So when Sid talked about 5 generations, her name was Brindle. My biggest memory of her is that when we would drive to see her, she'd say, "Did you come with the machine?" The car was, she called it the machine. She did not speak virtually no English.
She was the one with the farm outside.
She was the one with the farm.
Yeah, Pachev. Yep. There's a scrawny little horse they had on the farm. That's my mom's dad. This is school. This is the GPS dude that kept them alive in the woods. Unfortunately, he did not survive, but this was him in his Polish military uniform.
And he's who I'm named after. So,
And actually, the uncle that stayed in Germany named his son School after. This is the sister, I think it was also named Elke, School's sister, that was pregnant at the time and was killed alongside School in the woods. Now, can you see? Okay, that is my mom right there. We don't know who these two folks are, but there is Erwin's mom, that's Ella.
and that's most likely in the DP camp. They're already, my mother looks like she's like 12 or 13 at that point.
Ella is holding this book. I think, Erwin, you know that these are the partisans. She knows the person whose thumb she's holding, touching. These are the soldiers that they marched with and always stayed in the background, but they are the ones that were they're saving, they're guardian angels, trying to keep them alive and out of harm's way. This is the book called, is it Into the...
I think it's called Fighting Back.
Fighting Back. This was all the kids in the DP camp. This is my mother right here, but I cannot find Ella. What's interesting, this looks like Erwin, but it's not him. Can you see your mother in this picture? I don't think she's there.
That's my parents on the wedding day. And this is a family photo we took at somebody's.
It's Joshua's bar mitzvah.
Somebody's bar mitzvah.
Yeah. This is Leah and her husband Ken, who unfortunately passed away. Leah survived. She was born to Schendel and Vadja in Germany. And right here is Michael. He was the other one that was born in Germany. This is my dad, my mom. This is Michael's wife and the kids, the grandchildren. This is Chaim, Erwin's dad. That is my grandmother. There's Schendel right there. And that's Vadja, her husband. There's Erwin, Mary Beth, his wife, and Farley, his brother, and his wife, Deb. Sure I miss them. Here are the 3 sisters taken just a few days ago.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a wonderful picture. They were, so happy.
They get along so well, but in my father's side of the family, it's always who had it worst. You'll go to a wedding, and at the end of the wedding, when there's just nobody there, they will start to argue, who had it worse? Well, you had a potato, you had bread. I never had bread. This is what, Holocaust survivors talk about when no one else is listening. Again, they won't talk to us, but this they talk to amongst themselves.
Stop share. Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Right, so when they were crossing the road, the German soldiers saw them and waved to them. He shot in the air. So he could show his guys that he at least shot at them, but he didn't mean to shoot. He didn't mean to shoot them at all. Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So who knows? Yeah.
Well, Erwin and Sid, we have to end this part of the program. Thank you so much. And I really appreciated you calling them extraordinary, ordinary people. I think that sums it up, and I'm sure your moms are very proud of you tonight.
We're so proud of them.
Please thank them
Yeah.
from us, for us, for letting you share their stories. And
Joyce, if you're watching, there's a full house here. That's all it shows. Was it a lot of people?
a lot of people.
Was there food? Was there?
We usually have food at this event, but because of COVID and everything, we decided not to have. We had water. But
Trust me, she'll cater next time.
All right, so now we're going to show a video of Rosalie Garut from Kerem Shalom, who unfortunately couldn't be with us this evening. She's singing a song called The Quiet Night. There's a translation on the other side of the program. It was written about the partisans of Vilna. I'm sorry about the pronunciation. Lithuania, of which her father was one. A teacher and a son of Nazis from Germany heard the song and created a video, which he shared with his students, and we're going to share with you this evening.
Die Nacht ist ausgestemmt und der Frost hat gebrennt. Sie gedenkst du, wie ich hab dich gelernt. Haben a Speyer in die Hand. Sie gedenkst du, wie ich hab dich gelernt. Halten a Speyer in die Hand. A Beut, a Pelz und a Beret und Hand in Hand fest an a Gang. Han Beut mit a Sabeten im Bonim, mit op dem Säunes Karawan. Han Beut mit a Sabeten im Bonim, mit op dem Säunes Karawan. Gezielt, geschossen und getroffen.
So before we go, I'd like to just thank Ronnie Olitsky and Sarah Napier for organizing this evening, and also my co-chair, Shari Barzin, over there. And thank you to the Select Board for continuing to co-sponsor this event. Thank you to Court Booth, who helped out, and Chris Carmody, and Mark Polly, and all the tech crew. Let's see, to get on our email list and to support our work, you can go to our website. It's at cchumanrights.org. And we also always welcome new members on our council. So again, many thanks to Erwin and Sid, and to all of you for coming here, and everyone who's at home on Zoom. Let us never forget, let us always remember, and keep fighting injustice. Thank you, and have a good evening.